Hello, and welcome to the Mayer Summer Research Fellow virtual presentations. My name is Dr. Beth Greek-Palelli, and I have the privilege of serving as the Kurt Mayer Chair of Holocaust Studies at Pacific Lutheran University. Today we will hear from three outstanding PLU undergraduates. But first, please allow me a few words about our program and then to offer some serious thanks to our sponsors. The Kurt Mayer Summer Scholars Program offers generous financial support for PLU students who complete substantive research projects in Holocaust and genocide studies. Together with a faculty mentor, students spend a summer doing research and reading that culminates in a paper on a topic related to the Holocaust or to another type of genocide. The scholarship is named for Kurt Mayer, who fled Nazi Germany with his family on one of the last ships to carry Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany in April 1940. His family is joining us today, especially his widow, Pam Mayer. His daughter, Natalie, has been deeply involved with our programming, and she has spoken movingly of her father's legacy and vision, a legacy that she extended when she endowed the Natalie Mayer Holocaust and Genocide Studies Visiting Scholar and Artist Fund, which brings noted scholars to campus each year to give a lecture and to work with students in our Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. Natalie and the whole Mayer's family support of PLU students is especially fitting. Natalie herself enrolled as a student the first time our Introduction to Holocaust and Genocide Studies course was offered back in the fall of 2014. Natalie's interest in studying the Holocaust and other genocides is deeply personal and is linked to an urgent sense that studying history can and must point us to addressing bigotry and hatred in our own day. Please join me in thanking Natalie and the entire Mayer family, Pam Mayer, Kurt's wife, and Kurt's son and daughter-in-law, Joe and Gloria Mayer, for their ongoing belief in and generous support of the PLU Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. Our special thanks also go out to Nancy Powell, who along with her sister Carol Heller sponsor our yearly Powell-Heller Conference for Holocaust Education. Normally, our Mayer Summer Scholars would share their research at this conference, but due to COVID, like everything else, we've had to go to a new format. Our thanks also go out to the Gordon Thomas Honeywell legal firm for their generous support of the Mayer Summer Research Fellowships. This program is being recorded and will be available on the Holocaust and Genocide Studies webpage at PLU. We'll monitor questions from the audience and we'll try to ask as many as we can at the end of the presentations. I would now like to invite Dr. Lisa Marcus, Chair of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program here at PLU, to speak for a few minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Beth, for introducing us to the program today. I just want to give a few moments of greetings and thank you for all of you for joining us this afternoon, to the Powell-Heller families, and especially the Mayer family for endowing this important summer scholarship program that's been active at PLU for about a decade. We have extraordinary students who will be sharing their research today, several of whom I've gotten to work with specifically in the Intro to Holocaust and Genocide Studies class. And I want to encourage you all to listen, to ask questions, and to be involved in the presentation. We have a robust Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at PLU. We have over 20 minors. We graduated our first majors last spring, and we have 2 more majors coming along. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it back to Beth who will introduce our first speaker this afternoon. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate that. And it is my honor to be able to introduce our first student presenter for today's program, Mr. Zachary Gostisha. I was lucky enough to serve as Zachary's mentor over the summer, and even luckier that I've had to have the opportunity to teach him in several different courses. He is currently enrolled in the History of the Holocaust class with me this semester, so no pressure on him because his grade is obviously riding on this presentation. Only joking. But he is a fantastic student, very philosophical, and his project today addresses the writings of one of the leading Nazi ideologues, a man named Alfred Rosenberg. Rosenberg wrote a book called The Myth of the 20th Century, and this was really the only attempt of its time to bring together all of Nazi philosophy into one, well, in quotes, coherent system. Zach's work examines how Alfred Rosenberg attempted to intentionally create a theory that ultimately would be used to justify Nazi crimes against humanity. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Zach.
Thank you, and thank you everyone who's watching or contributing, the Mayer family in particular, for being willing to support what we do, which is absolutely thoroughly appreciated, and everyone who helped put this Zoom conversation together. So this presentation, as we just heard, instead of talking about the tangible manifestations of genocide or how different folks respond to genocide, will focus on the way that a horrific genocidal way of thinking about the world was constituted. So to do so, I have looked at many of the writings of Alfred Rosenberg, who you can see on this title slide. Rosenberg was an influential Nazi writer, as well as a high-ranking member of the German government during the Hitler regime. So the title is Great Men of German Blood, because that is explicitly a quote from Rosenberg describing the only people whom he thought mattered. You can see here that my focus is going to parallel the subtitle of my presentation as well as the title of this slide. First, I'm going to begin by talking a bit about my subject of study, Alfred Rosenberg, and why he in particular is a useful person to think about when we try to understand Nazi ideology, just so that we can have a solid way of grounding the rest of the presentation. From there, I'll get into Rosenberg's conception of Nazi identity. In essence, Rosenberg's ideal German was defined by their ability to fit in a specific model of racial and gender characteristics. In many ways, his ideological system parallels those that we see in extremist racial movements across the globe. So in one sense, one could simply talk about his exclusive views of race and gender. But it is in the particulars of how he derived those views and how he justified them that we can find interesting and potentially new things to know about Nazi Germany. In fact, it's pretty clearly correct to point out that when you're studying Nazi ideas, you can't ever expect much consistency. But I want to layer on two ideas to the fact that there's a lack of consistency with Nazis. First, I argue that there was some form of consistency in Rosenberg's ideas, and that he always embraced whatever he thought could contribute to a masculine pan-German dominance of the globe. What was inconsistent was simply how dominance could be claimed in different realms of life. The second layer is that I argue that the presence of inconsistencies, and more important, the nature of those inconsistencies in his ideas, can still tell us useful things about Nazi identity. So that's all kind of a roundabout way of introducing the two areas where Rosenberg stands out from others who sought to justify similar crimes, which I want to talk about. The first is his use of a falsified history to justify his view of the world, and then his application of a twisted version of aesthetic theory to imply that every single thing in existence was a product of race. Both were crucial elements in his philosophy, or attempt at philosophy. At first glance, this is an exceptionally cursory topic to study. After all, racists are racist, and asking them why is only going to result in a racist answer. But I believe, and I argue, that it is crucial to understand how extremists self-consciously design their ideological strata if we want to unpack how people intentionally create theories to justify crimes against humanity, and crucially, if we want to prevent those theories from spreading. So, a little bit about Rosenberg. He was initially born in the city of Revel, which is now the capital of Estonia, and when it was still part of the Russian Empire. His family was ethnically German, though, which fostered a strong sense of German nationalism in him from an early age. He immigrated to Germany during the Russian Revolution in 1918 and became very quickly involved in far-right anti-Semitic politics. He joined the German Workers' Party, which was the predecessor organization to the Nazi Party, very early into existence and very quickly became one of its leading propagandists. In 1923, he became the senior editor of the party's flagship newspaper, and later that year took part in the attempted Nazi coup in Munich, after which Hitler was arrested. While Hitler was in prison, he vested the official leadership of the party in Rosenberg and then revoked it after a little while because Hitler didn't like what Rosenberg had been doing. From that point forward, Rosenberg became an important writer on behalf of the Nazi movement, but never regained a seat in the inner circle around Hitler. Rosenberg was the minister of the occupied Eastern Territories during the Second World War, and he was generally disliked by his colleagues, which kind of pushed him into the ideological and propaganda area of Nazi Germany. What is most important about him is that he was the head of the Nazi Party's ideological mechanism, the designer of their new higher education system, and the author of many pieces of influential propaganda, which is mostly what I look at, especially the myth of the 20th century. The myth, as Dr. GP said, was the only attempt to synthesize and systematize all of Nazi philosophy and political thought, which makes the myth especially important to think about when we're trying to understand the contours of Nazi identity. So let's dig in. Rosenberg's falsified history was not the process of critically engaging with the past. Instead, it was the strongest tool in a racist arsenal for advancing arguments in favor of Germanic supremacy. To ground his philosophy and its implications for German identity, Rosenberg gave readers of the myth a long genealogy of modern Germany, which, if he could convince enough people was accurate, could end in his preferred destructive policy recommendations. He explicitly rejected the notion that history should tie anyone to any particular form of action. But instead, he claimed that racial groups are absolutely free to obey the commands of some inner racial soul, and that it is only in history where people can find proof of that claim. In one of his early articles in 1919, he already wrote that, quote, "A human being or a folk movement that is genuine and strong is itself history and power, and hence also shapes history." And that he also wrote in that same article that the history-forming elements of the world were race, folk, and tribe, literally admitting or claiming to admit that all of the world history was, in his view, a product of race. So this genealogical method of highlighting how a particular object, concept, or form came to be the way it is was one that Rosenberg expropriated for intentional manipulation here, with an important emphasis on how Germanic heroes are a major part of how a people is awakened to its present racialized powers, so that history outlines heroes and then awaken people into themselves. The purpose of history, then, for Rosenberg, was to identify racial groups and elevate those which he considered Germanic. To him, all of history was nothing but a series of clashes between races, and the concept of freedom for him relies on the concept of race in a way that would make it implicitly impossible for any human being who was not German to be free. The flip side of this idea is that freedom, love of freedom, possession of freedom, and exercise of freedom are all supposed to be qualities of Rosenberg's ideal German. So if a person was not dedicated to making sure that they, and whoever else who counted as German, were completely free, that person could not be fully German. Rosenberg was also self-consciously invested in aesthetics, perhaps more than any other element of his writing. He openly thought of himself as revolutionizing the field of allowing the discipline to be finally understood as a racial product in his view. And of course, he argued that it always had been, and he was the first person to discover this. Art for him was already a product of race, but he claimed that, quote, the form-linked nature of an art will be the only truly comprehensible to those of the same blood. That is, he believed that members of any racial group could only understand art made by others in the same racial group. Only Germans could truly understand art, and only Germans could truly create art. So many people who study conspiracy theories talk about how they're self-sealing, which is the idea that they operate so that any challenge to the conspiracy theory is explained by the theory. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that invent plots of Jewish media control, for example, allow anti-Semites to argue that any factual information contrary to their worldview is sourced from the same sort of Jewish media figures whom they falsely accuse of manipulating the news. And this is the function of Rosenberg's analysis of art, history, and all sorts of other elements of life outside the ordinary purview of politics. Because he argued that aesthetic will determined a person's racial character, impulses, and sense of existence, layered on top of his argument that history is racial and race is historical, everything becomes entirely self-sealing and self-justified. Because only a German man could create or understand true art, only German men could decide what counted as creating or understanding art. So I think I'm a bit low on time, but the other important thing here is that the qualities Rosenberg assigned to German history and art were deeply gendered, and he often explicitly divided the world into binaries to reinforce the idea that only German men were capable of truly mattering. All of his history was a binary between a mythical Aryan race and whatever other races he invented. All of politics was a binary between good Nazis and bad everyone else. Really, most of his philosophy was founded on binaries, one of the most important of which was gender. So to wrap up, Rosenberg explicitly wrote about Nazism as an ideology. He claimed that it had coherent, systematic principles, and part of the appeal that he emphasized in his propaganda was that it could provide an alternative to those who were frustrated with liberalism or communism. This means that separate from the influence Nazi ideological principles on Nazi actions actually directly had, the content of his ideology did play a role in formation and recruitment for his government. Moreover, interlocutors like Rosenberg served to explain and translate the formal principles of political parties into clear language and concepts for those who do not actively follow politics. His ideas are therefore crucial to understanding Nazi thought because he was self-consciously philosophical and intellectual, though his ideas have no merit because they were absolutely racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic, and imperialist. But I argue that terrible philosophy is still philosophy, and it is virtually impossible to understand the point of Rosenberg's ideas without first examining the intellectual scaffolding that is history and aesthetics within which he placed them. These ideas were not different from those of other Nazis, but because he sought to subsume all of Nazi philosophy into an infinitely historical aesthetic experience that supposedly only German men could articulate, he was able to argue that any person who failed to agree with him was not German, not a man, and not worth existing. This infinite, totalizing nature of Rosenberg's writings make his ideas especially dangerous and especially worth understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. That was absolutely wonderful. And I really appreciate that the smoothness with which you gave that presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next faculty mentor. This particular student, Connor Lemma, was mentored by two faculty members, and their names are Dr. Giovanna Erdegararing. I apologize, I look at the name and I have such a hard time, and Dr. Ksenia Simic-Muller. And I will hand it over to Giovanna to introduce the student she mentored. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Giovanna Erdegararing, and I'm an associate professor of Hispanic and Latino studies here at PLU. This past summer, my colleague Ksenia Simic-Muller, Associate Professor of Math, and I had the pleasure to work as faculty mentors with Connor Lema, who is pursuing a triple major in Hispanic and Latino Studies, Math, and Philosophy, with a minor in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Connor's major research project focuses on the Guatemalan genocide, a historical tragedy that took place in the 1980s and whose consequences remain visible today, not only within the borders of the Central American country, where over 43% of the population who self-identify as indigenous continue to struggle to overcome disenfranchisement and structural racism, but also here in Washington State, where according to data gathered by the organization Columbia Legal Services back in 2012, approximately 1,200 Guatemalans of Maya descent work mostly in agriculture, facing difficult conditions. Connor's commitment to social justice, combined with his intellectual curiosity, resulted in a unique and insightful research project that looked at data and testimony and their joint potential to narrate the atrocities inherent to genocide. Oftentimes, we treat data and human stories as opposites and express a strong preference for one over the other. Connor seeks to reconcile the two. In his paper, Connor asks important questions. Whose story and what memories are embedded in numbers used to convey violent histories? What information do numbers give when compared to what is told by a survivor? What ethical considerations do we have to make when dealing with data? What is lost in numbers and gained in testimonies, and vice versa? Is it relevant, necessary, or even appropriate to establish such a comparison? Thank you. I'm looking forward to your presentation, Connor.
Thank you so much, Professors Urdangarin and Professor Simic-Muller. It's been a pleasure to work with you this summer. Let me just share my screen here. And I would also like to sincerely thank the Mayer family for their generous support in allowing us to be able to do this summer. The title of my paper, Memory Studies in Numbers, Why Representation of Violence and Genocide Matters, was not my original title. As we will see in a second, my research took a little bit of a shift. But first, I want to talk about the background of the Guatemalan genocide and why it happened. The indigenous people in Guatemala at this time had different societal structures that were seen as communist, and as soon as they were seen as communist in this political structure, they were seen as the enemy, even though they had nothing to do with being anti-government. And because there were guerrilla fighters who were not indigenous but also anti-government, and they were somehow surviving in the hills around where the indigenous people were living, the government then had an excuse to decimate, and there was a scorched earth policy against all of these indigenous villages. And in cities, people that were seen as either communist or pro-indigenous or anti-government, they were also heavily targeted as well. So at the beginning of my research in Professor Urdangarin's class, I got the opportunity to read this paper by Dr. Timothy Golden, who looked mathematically at the Guatemalan genocide and found, for example, that there's a very specific population range that suffered the most violence, which it seems a little counterintuitive at first, but then when you look at it within different lenses, the reasons start to come up that less or more community involvement could potentially protect them, as well as we see all of the frequency of killings and the percent indigenous, and they all kind of center around the same area. So the background of my research and why I said that the title changed, I wanted to continue Dr. Golden's research in El Salvador because there are similar data sets that exist. However, as soon as I started doing the data manipulation, I worked with SQL, which is a computer language that does a lot of big data analysis, and I was able to work with spreadsheets and find the amount of violent instances that were happening in certain departments across, which they is a similar thing to states. So across departments, time, and ethnicities. However, I started running into these problems with hundreds and hundreds of these records were lacking where they happened. And so if we look at this next slide, the table on the right is missing a state because almost all of those records of violent instances didn't include where they happened. So having a state missing seemed like a very big problem to me. And on the left here, we have one of the tables from the Guatemalan genocide. Or no, that one's from El Salvador, sorry. But the Guatemalan genocide also has some interesting data problems because the vast majority of those data came from the point of view of the perpetrators, which to me felt a little bit problematic if I was going to be doing a comprehensive data analysis of a very biased data set. Similarly, these are all convenience samples, and I wouldn't be able to take solid statistical inferences from these and feel like I could definitively say there are a certain population range across time and location that suffered violence. I feel like that would be doing a disservice to allocating different resources or however we use that information to prevent genocides in the future, which originally was my goal, to find and confirm golden studies that across time and space there is a certain population range that is at a bigger risk to developing violence in their area. So as I said, I began to look back at Guatemala and see the conflict as a whole, and then realize how there are intersections between collective memory and also statistical representation, the benefits of using statistical representation and testimony to think about the genocide as a whole and not focus too much on the numbers and really reduce these people to like an individual line as a spreadsheet, as we saw earlier. So right here is a very instrumental figure in the restorative justice process in Guatemala. This is Dr. Patrick Ball. He is the head of the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, the group which put out a lot of the estimates, and they did a bunch of very intense computer programs that were able to take the different data sets from conflict areas really around the world, but they also did this in Guatemala, and they're able to filter out duplicate records and get accurate information. So one of the court hearings where they were able to take the perpetrators of the genocide, the high-level government members, Dr. Patrick Ball testified there, and he had murder rates against indigenous people in times that were not considered the genocide and then also the genocide. And there were clear statistical anomalies that in the years 1981 to 1983, there were a lot more instances of violence against these people. And that compared with testimony from different survivors and people that knew about Guatemalan culture, which I'll get to later, were one of the reasons why initially the perpetrators were convicted, but then later by the Guatemalan Supreme Court, those convictions were thrown out. But with all of this statistical reasoning, there are some profoundly ethical questions that I was thinking of. For example, what should be the statistical difference to call something targeted? Or is there an amount of people that need to suffer before we can say, yes, you were targeted on purpose? Or is there a story that we need to hear? Or how can we think about that? And the second comes from the United Nations definition of genocide, which is as follows. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part. And this in whole or in part is also something that at the creation of the word genocide, people were really grappling with, because what makes a whole or what makes in part? And at the beginning, people were thinking just one person means in part, because there was a targeted effort to eliminate them based on their national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And that was another really ethical problem that the numbers can't totally show, which is like what is in part and what considers a genocide, and then what do we just name mass killing. So the philosophical ramifications of just using data and not thinking about what these numbers represent is something that I was looking at very deeply in this project. And then on the other side, as Giovanna was saying earlier, people don't usually think of numbers and witness testimony as like working so closely together. But these memory studies, even though this happened in the past, collective memory as a prevention tool in post-genocide periods ends up being instrumentally important. So memory is created by what other people remember, and this affects how other people learn about what happened. And we can see this in Dr. James Waller. He has a book called Confronting Evil, Engaging in Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide. And in this, he quotes Clara Ramirez Barat, and she says that memorialization, and this really summed up my project nicely, and I read this as I was finishing up, but she writes that first, memorialization promotes the preservation and recovery of memory. It also contributes to acknowledging and raising awareness about past abuses. Memorialization can also promote public debate and deliberation. Fifth, memorialization can promote the recovery of truth and the pursuit of justice, which is what I will focus on in the next few minutes. And then finally, it promotes prevention or guarantees of non-recurrence by engaging the general public, particularly the youth, in a productive dialogue about a repressive past. So when you have, in the stages of genocide, the government trying to denounce that a genocide occurred, trying to suggest that it didn't happen, which happened with the Guatemalan genocide, and which was why Dr. Ball's testimony was so important, they, as an excuse, were saying and arguing that the genocide happened as a result of war, which is an all too common excuse, as we see across different time periods and different spaces. And this, along with the memory of these people who were targeted and who survived, dismantles the oppressive dialogue of the government in this time. And also, as a literary genre, as I was reading, testimony is a very big part of the memorialization process. And we can not only see testimony as a text, and this is quoted, it is also a project of social justice in which text is an instrument. Testimonial narratives are doubly connected to their life world in their inceptions as responses to speakers' real-life experiences of injustice, and also by their intended outcomes in social action on the part of leaders. End quote. And as a result of this project, I was able to speak with the survivor of the Guatemalan genocide. It looked much different than I was expecting it would. We were outside, 6 feet apart. It was a very incredible experience. And I do argue and I advocate for in this paper using the memory of survivors, how they want it to be used, and not using that for the researcher's personal gain, which was something that anthropologists would go do in Guatemala, and they would come in, they would just write and read about it, and then they would leave without doing any tangible support to make sure that we can move the testimony from these survivors into memorialization in order to prevent future genocides. And so I thank you to Gustavo Reyna, and through my conversation with him, it showed me how difficult yet important it is for survivors to share their story, because this conversation showed the power of the memorialization through education and awareness. And he brought to me comparisons between what he is seeing around the world and in the United States right now with what happened in Guatemala. And the most crucial aspect that I gained from our conversation was the element of human experience and memory to represent the oppressed and disenfranchised stories of perseverance, but also resistance in the face of unthinkable pressure and fear. And one of the things that Gustavo said when he was living in Guatemala, the Guatemalan government's goal is to show that they had power over every aspect of daily life and to render people powerless. And this knowledge helps construct the collective memory post-conflict and builds a resilient, robust community with a peaceful and restorative justice-oriented culture. And as I start to wrap up, using Guatemala as a case study was really, really interesting to me, because where the typical legal system failed because there is not any justice for the perpetrators of the genocide, because they got off after they were convicted. This helps give us restorative justice, which is another way that we can look at this by calling it a genocide. There's a famous rap song in Guatemala with the title, "Yes, There Was a Genocide," and that helps, again, like Ramirez Barat said, engages the youth, engages people in a different manner in order to make us think differently. And comprehensive and intersectional thinking are the only way that we can think about genocide in the future, looking at numbers, realizing the scope, and being able to compartmentalize and contextualize what has happened, but also by listening to survivors, hearing what they want us to do, and really just listening. And I end my paper with the same quote, but the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg writes that generally change in our society is incremental. Real change, enduring change happens one step at a time. And I say that the first step that we need to do is we need to listen to survivors, analyze representative data, and collectively create narratives that promote peace and understanding. Thank you.
Connor, that was fantastic. And I, as a historian, as soon as you put those numbers up, I thought, oh, this is going to be difficult, but you made it so understandable. And it was really just fascinating that you were able to bring statistics and collective memory together into this project. It's now my honor to introduce Dr. Kirsten Christensen, who served as a faculty mentor for another outstanding student, Nicole Query.
Thank you. I'm Kirsten Christensen, professor of German and affiliated faculty, along with the others here in the program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And it was my pleasure this summer to work with Nicole Query, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Nicole is a junior majoring in history, and she's one of our few individualized majors in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She plans to study away in Rwanda this coming summer and potentially J-term of her senior year. Both of these are dependent, of course, on the pandemic. She plans on graduate school for an MA in either history, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, or education, still to be determined. She first learned about the Rwandan genocide in her sophomore year of high school, which is very encouraging that schools are studying that. And she's been doing the best she can to study Rwanda ever since. The research you will hear today, which is nicely linked in many ways with what Connor just presented, was inspired by an Oxford tutorial in spring of this year on humanitarianism and genocide, when Nicole realized how often the voices of survivors and refugees are not heard when governments discuss solutions to humanitarian events. Nicole is a careful, thorough researcher and a deeply engaged scholar, and it was such an honor to work with her this summer, and I turn the time over to her.
All right. Cool. All right, sorry, technical issues. Hello, to start, I would like to thank the Kurt Mayer family for making this research possible and for continuing to support PLU students in their research into Holocaust and genocide-related topics. I'd also like to thank Dr. Beth Greek-Palelli, Dr. Lisa Marcus, and especially Dr. Kirsten Christensen, who was my mentor on this project, for believing in me and for supporting my research. I'll start with some background. The basic contours of the 1994 genocide of the Tutsis by Hutus in Rwanda are widely known, but as with all genocides, the Rwandan genocide had deep roots of systemic violence in the decades that preceded it. When colonial forces took over in the 1800s, they gradually solidified the social and economic distinctions between Hutu and Tutsi into artificial ethnic identities, sowing the seeds of hatred as they favored the minority Tutsis and placed them over the Hutu majority. A history of violence between Hutu and Tutsi followed, coming to a head during 1994 when peace talks between the Hutu government and Tutsi rebel force, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, fell apart following the president's assassination on April 6, 1994. For the next 3 months, an estimated 800,000 to 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed by the government and Interahamwe militia forces, as well as willing citizens. In journalist Philip Gorovich's chilling description, 800,000 were killed in 100 days. That's 333 and a third murders an hour, or 5.5 lives terminated every minute of every day for 100 days. The massacres only stopped once the Rwandan Patriotic Front took over the control of the capital on July 4th, 1994. The international community was aware of the genocide but did nothing to respond. My essay seeks to illuminate the ways in which survivor testimony has not been fully exploited to reveal the depth of failure and human cost of the inaction during the genocide. Survivor testimony has been gathered in great quantity by many organizations, including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and, ironically, by the UN, the very organization that most profoundly failed Rwanda. These and other organizations have extensive video and written testimony archives by a variety of survivors and aid workers. While survivor testimony plays a role in all scholarship related to the Rwandan genocide, much of it has not made its way to the center of the discussion of the failure of the international community to intervene. As I will argue, the testimonies of many survivors suggest that the depth of failure is much broader than is often relayed in the conventional story. Survivor testimony can, in some cases, reveal basic institutional problems in the UN's ability to set aside interests such as the strategic value of a country or economic concerns in order to do their mandated work of prevention and response. In the existing narrative, it is clear that within Rwanda, the Tutsi minority were dehumanized as cockroaches, enezi, by many of the Hutu majority. However, I will argue that survivor testimony suggests that the dehumanization of Tutsis also existed and continues to exist on a much larger international scale, leading to what I refer to as double dehumanization. This international dehumanization can first be seen in the failure by the US and other major powers, such as Belgium, to halt the killings in Rwanda because doing so did not line up with their interests. Second, this dehumanization was evident in the lack of justice against perpetrators. Finally, survivors have further been dehumanized through the enduring lack of attention and aid given to them in the years since the genocide. Accounts reveal that survivors remain acutely aware that Rwandans were and are not seen as important or strategic enough to motivate the international community to act in any meaningful way. For the purposes of this presentation, I will highlight the second area of dehumanization through survivor accounts that speak to the lack of justice brought to perpetrators. I will start with an account from survivor Rupert Bonza, who now lives in Canada, describing his experience of being in a Western country for the first time. I get to Montreal and an ambulance goes by. The firemen and everyone clears the street. It scared me. I thought it was war. Then I asked the taxi driver, "What's going on? Is there a war coming?" He tells me, "It's an emergency. Somewhere, a life was in danger." I thought I heard him wrong because he said a life is in danger. Maybe one life or more. So I understood that the West knew urgency, but I didn't know that they held it at such a high level, to the point where everyone moved out of the way to allow an ambulance to get by. I didn't think you hurried when there were problems, you know. When I think that in Rwanda we waited for 3 months, that's one of the things that disheartened me deeply. There was an important emergency, but they didn't react like that. Using administrative documents and even to some extent humanitarian aid worker testimony to point out the lack of care and attention brought to Rwanda can never encapsulate the feelings of abandonment and insignificance that Bonza brings to bear. His lived experience speaks directly to the failure and hypocrisy of the West. His testimony calls to question the systems that are still in place in the UN today and calls for a change in the way the Western world views distant peoples and problems. Another survivor, Damascus Simba, a Hutu who saved over 400 children during multiple standoffs with militia at the orphanage he directed, critiques the very idea of an international community and the justice it supposedly carries. He states, "I had always heard the term the international community, but where is this international community? One gets the feeling that it is very far away from every country that exists on Earth. In the beginning, there was UNAMIR, a mission of the United Nations for Rwanda that was patrolling in Kigali. We had a feeling of being under the protection of a foreign force, but when it all began, they abandoned us. They left." If there is such a thing as an international community dedicated to the welfare of a common humanity and in charge of upholding international laws such as the 1948 Convention on Genocide, then as Gasimba states, it must be very far away indeed. There can be no justice in an international community that picks and chooses when to act on the very conventions it ratified and only does so according to the self-interests of the great powers who are granted status on the UN Security Council. Moving to a local scale, the post-genocide Rwandan government had hundreds of thousands of perpetrators to indict for their actions in the genocide. Due to the large volume of cases, community gacaca courts were favored over larger scale, more formal judicial methods. In the gacaca process, survivors recounted what happened to them in the genocide, and perpetrators confessed and apologized. A council of local judges issued a verdict. Many perpetrators did not do jail time. Instead, they participated in community service, in many cases alongside the remaining members of the families they murdered. Although praised by many in the international community, survivor testimony reveals that the gacaca courts were not just coercive, but also traumatizing for those who had to indict others. One survivor, Jean, was called to a gacaca in order to testify against someone who had confessed to killing her family, something she had not previously known. I had a visit from the Nuambakami, the judges, who told me that the accused had made a statement that he had killed my family. I was amazed. It was like God had struck me down. Of course, I could not say no, because it is my duty to forgive. So he, the accused, stood up, and I recognized him as the husband of my sister. How can I get peace like this? Really, I wish I had never learned the truth as gacaca says it is. The gacaca courts, which ended in 2012, could not function without survivor testimony, as it was the backbone for legitimizing claims of what happened during the genocide, and served as evidence to indict perpetrators. This had the unfortunate consequence of requiring survivors to relive their trauma. As Jean notes, this cannot bring peace, only more harm to survivors. Survivor testimony also crucially highlights the idea of justice lost, or justice which can never be achieved due to the extent of the horrors that occurred in Rwanda. The ability to indict perpetrators cannot take away the pain and trauma survivors endured. Gaudios laments on the impact that the genocide had on himself and other survivors. It is now 14 years since the genocide, but to me, it is just like yesterday. Those who survived have nothing to look forward to. We live in the shadow of the genocide. Many of us are scarred for life, physically, mentally, and psychologically. People are hurting. They are crying out for help, crying out for justice. The Rwandan genocide should never be forgotten. The trauma that survivors have endured following the genocide follows them everywhere they go, in the streets where they may see their families' killers, to the memorials where the bodies of their loved ones lie on display, to the places where the atrocities occurred. Thus, justice is unattainable, no matter who is indicted. Crucially, Gaudios, like other survivors, seems to suggest that justice may come on a broader level if remembrance prevents genocide from being perpetuated on other groups in the future. These diverse accounts make clear that the justice survivors seek is vastly different from the more formal justice agenda of the international community. Rather than focusing on indicting perpetrators, survivors speak to the failure to prevent atrocities in the first place and on addressing the profound traumas that remain. For survivors, justice is beyond reach. By articulating this soul-crushing reality, survivors establish themselves as the true authority on the failures of the international community. While the accounts of many survivors have been gathered and archived, their insights remain largely unexplored in regards to our understanding of the failure of the United Nations and the international community to act. These accounts reveal the double dehumanization of Rwandan Tutsis and moderate Hutus who were not deemed important or strategic enough to be given attention by the world's major powers, and thus highlight the past and continuing human cost of international failure. Dehumanization by the international community are better understood because genocide and atrocity continue. If almost 1 million Rwandan Tutsis and moderate Hutu could be killed without intervention, it raises alarm for others who are in similar situations. Tactics of distraction like those used by the UN in Rwanda have been on display recently in Darfur, Syria, and Myanmar, to name just some. By listening carefully to survivors, we honor them and those who are lost, and by extension, learn more about how, when, and why we failed to protect them in the first place, and perhaps how we can do better going forward. Thank you.
You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Nicole. That was very, very moving. And I appreciate Kirsten jumping in there to tell me I was muted. Sometimes there's a delay, I think. I really can't thank the students enough for the passion that they bring to their projects. If you think about what we've just done, in the space of about 45 minutes, we've gone from 1930s Nazi Germany to the 1980s in Guatemala, and then we've gone to the 1990s of Rwanda. And it really is, in many respects, so depressing and so sad to see that we can keep finding examples of genocide, and that we can question how much has the world actually learned from the experience of Auschwitz. And so I'd like to open it up now to questions from our audience, as well as from our faculty mentors for our student presenters. We have at least a few minutes that we can kind of get a little bit more information. And right now, I don't see anything added in the chat. So if it's okay, since I have the microphone, I'd like to ask Zach to elaborate. He was not able in his presentation to really address issues of gender, but I was wondering if you could just speak briefly to that, since that is so critical to Rosenberg's outlook, right? It's German and it's German men. What about women, right? Where does half the world's population fit in his philosophical system? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different ways that gender is really important to him. And you've read the paper, so you see how I go through all these different ways. I guess I can talk about a few different levels at which he talks about gender. So the most basic one is that when he describes what the ideal German is supposed to be like, he uses extremely masculine vocabulary. He says the ideal German is strong, the ideal German dominates others, the ideal German is someone who, he even, I think, uses physical descriptions like large and powerful and towers over people. And if it was one of these kind of adjectives in an isolated sense, you might say, oh, it doesn't necessarily have to be gendered, but it is very clearly gendered when you add them up and see how they relate to other things. Right. That's just on the level description. In his attempt to create a philosophy, which I think doesn't really make that much sense other than the fact that it tries to reinforce Nazi power, like I said in my presentation, he constructs a binary between masculine and feminine. And what he does is he says that everyone who he doesn't like is inherently feminine. So he says that Jewish people are inherently feminine. He says that anybody who isn't white too is inherently feminine. And he just assigns femininity to anyone who he thinks is bad. And then he says that this is one of the fundamental divisions of society, and says that because we have this fundamental division, this is one of the key ways that we know that we know, right? Very much, I very much think this is horrific, but he says that this is how we know that Nazi ideology is true, because we know that the gender binary is true. So it's part of his philosophy. There's the adjectives and language, it's all over the place. But yeah, those are two ways that I think it's clear.
And I guess I keep wondering, what did his wife think about that? Yeah. Did he get a stern talking to at night when he got home?
That, I have to ask, as a German professor, you know, the word for a German, there are two different words, whether you're talking about a German man or a German woman. So what does, when he says a German, does he only use the masculine term and he simply doesn't refer? I don't know if you read German, but I'd just be really curious to know if he even uses the feminine ever.
Yeah, so because of what I was doing, I read translations of everything, because I thought that would be let me do a lot more effective research rather than trying to keep a German dictionary next to me and constantly spend hours and hours figuring everything out. I don't read German. So I don't know. But
you happen to know, Beth, if you...
You know, I don't know. That's a fascinating question. So that's something I'm going to look up once we are finished today.
My assumption is that in German, the male grammar or grammatical male is always the default. So that would be my assumption is what he did.
That's what I would guess, but I honestly, I'm just racking my brain right now if I can think of any examples where I've seen the feminine version.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a great question.
It's only important because it obviously the language worked there well for his philosophy, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, and I think over our chat, again, people are using our chat feature, which is fantastic. And it looks like we had a question that popped in for Nicole. And the question is, how did your introduction to the Rwandan genocide in high school compare to what you've encountered in your studies? How much did survivor testimony play into your first understanding of the subject?
So when my teacher introduced our unit on genocide, we kind of looked over, you know, the 9 stages of genocide. That's, I mean, you can find that pretty much anywhere, as well as Hotel Rwanda, which is the story of Paul Rusesabagina, where he, if you don't know the story, he set up the Milcolin Hotel and kept Tutsis inside and safe from the militia forces through bargaining with the Interahamwe militia. So I guess in that case, I did focus on the story of Paul Rusesabagina, which I believe he helped with the creation of that movie, but I might be wrong on that. Yeah, he did. So I suppose my introduction was entirely at that point focused on a story of a specific survivor, but it didn't really go beyond to talk about I don't want to say like ordinary individuals, but Paul Rusesabagina is kind of a famous Rwandan survivor. So I suppose to answer your question more briefly, it played a large role, but it did not talk about less famous survivors. Yes.
He's been, Rusesabagina has been an outspoken critic of the regime, and he's currently in prison. He was captured under very nefarious circumstances and is currently in custody in Rwanda. That's a whole nother story, but
Wow.
His fame undid him or is troubling.
My goodness. All right, well, we have a question for Connor as well. And in the chat, the person asked, you talked about the limitations of data as they reduce humans to lines and spreadsheets. Are there any benefits to understanding genocide through this reduction?
There are massive benefits as well, and I didn't elaborate as much on that as I could have, but Dr. Ball's testimony when he showed like these charts and the data that clearly show there's a discrepancy between the amount of people that were killed or amount of indigenous people that were killed pre-genocide stages and then when there was the defined genocide stage, those numbers were so staggering that it was, you couldn't have had the conviction without those numbers, but at the same time, you wouldn't have had those convictions without the testimony of the people that validated those numbers. So again, they work so hand in hand, like when we look at those charts and we see where the violence was concentrated and what was where, that's incredible that we have those numbers, but also those little dots are all people's stories. And Dr. Waller in his book writes about that he had to just take a step back because he was seeing all of these spreadsheets and all of, which is, again, incredibly valuable information that we can look at this and use SQL and other computer programs to statistically and mathematically represent what has happened during genocides, but the amount of human experience that is in those lines is, we can't forget about that either.
Well, Connor, I think that, I mean, it really, you've convinced me about the need to kind of marry together statistics with personal stories of experience, that they really shouldn't be, as Giovanna had pointed, they shouldn't be the opposites. They should be working in tandem. And for some people, seeing those dots on a map really alerts them and kind of shakes them out of complacency. And then for other people to read even just one survivor's account that moves them is enough to spark an action from them. And so I think it really is a need for us to recognize that we have to have both, right? That we need the statistical information, but we also have to have that testimony of survivors that can give a kind of personal touch to it and humanize it in a way that perhaps the numbers for some people might not do it for them. But you have made me a believer. And also for people who are participating, if you look in our chat room, Dr. Marcus is super speedy, and she has looked up a New York Times article reporting on what Dr. Christensen and what Nicole have just mentioned about the arrest of Paul from Hotel Rwanda. So if people are interested in knowing more details about that, I would direct you to that link. And thank you to Dr. Marcus for being so quick on the draw there. That was amazing. I see from looking at the time, it's exactly 5 o'clock, and we promised everyone that we would set you free at 5. I really want to, again, express my sincere thanks to the entire Mayer family, to Nancy Powell and Carol Heller, Gordon Thomas Honeywell. Without their support, we would not be able to fund the students and the faculty mentors doing this research and working together. You can see the high caliber of the end product of what students are capable of studying and producing. I really can't stress enough to our audience how valuable these projects are. Many of our students will go on to get master's degrees and PhDs, and they're the future educators. So it's critically important that this type of work continues on. For students who've joined us for today's presentation, I really thank you. If any of you are interested in knowing more about Holocaust and genocide studies as a minor, as an individualized major, or as information for applying to do your own summer research, you can go to the Holocaust and Genocide Studies webpage at PLU. And again, this program has been recorded, so you can tell family and friends that they can tune in. And thank you so much to all of our faculty mentors. Without you, the students would not be able to complete these projects as professionally as they have. So my thanks to everyone, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.